let's I'm going to go ahead and end the poll right now. Yeah, so let's look at the results. So it seems like there's a lot of fourth years here, and then also a good amount of third years. And it's kind of also just spread around, which is good. The AGPM, let's see. All right, so that's good. So some experience with building a website. Okay, so it seems like kind of split between people who have made a portfolio and people who haven't. So it's kind of in the middle, which is interesting. Okay, most people have written a resume. A lot of anxiety, it seems like, towards making one. Let's see. All right. A lot of people don't know what the first step is. Okay. Other portfolios. Okay, so that's good. A lot of people seem to have some examples that they've looked at. Seems like there's a bit of confusion about who the audience is, and as well as what your overall story or narrative is as well. That's interesting. So we're going to go ahead and once this at the end of this event, we're going to kind of relaunch the poll again, and so hopefully those numbers change for the better by the end of this by today, and then hopefully by the end of the 3 weeks, everyone will be in a much better place. So yeah, and now I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Kristen Gillette, and take it away.
Great, thank you so much. So hello everybody, I am the instructor for this workshop, and I recognize a lot of names here. I am a lecturer in the arts division, so I teach a lot of courses for the art department, and then also I have developed a few courses for AGPM. I guess just one at this point, but then I know that I oftentimes have a lot of AGPM folks taking my my art courses as well. And so I have this background in digital arts and new media. I went to the DANM program, and then I started teaching afterwards. But then before that, I guess I still am a graphic designer and a practicing illustrator. And I have definitely had to work with creating my own portfolio before. And then also as a designer, I have worked with this idea of designing portfolios, and I understand the anxiety when it comes to creating a portfolio, because I do know that it's, as creative folks, we think about our work, and a lot of times we're thinking visually, and I think that it can be really challenging to start to have to communicate those ideas through portfolio, and to think about essentially branding your work and presenting your work to a different audience. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. And with this series of workshops, it's going to be looking at how we craft a portfolio, some of the different considerations that go into building a portfolio, what we're actually designing for when we're thinking about portfolios, and then looking at some of the platforms that are available. So there's going to be a very technical component, and that's mostly what we're going to be looking at for the future workshops. And then this first part is more of an introduction, and really looking into what goes into creating a portfolio. What are the design considerations that that you have to make, and the different choices that you have to make, and how do you even start that? What are you designing for when it comes to a portfolio? And so that's really what we're going to be looking at for this first workshop. And so I'm going to be working a lot with, I'm going to have some sharing the screen and going through a series of slides, just presenting some ideas, some considerations. And then there's also going to be some activities for folks to work on within the actual session. So while we are going through things, I'll definitely make sure to say, okay, let's take 10 minutes to do this thing. But we're going to be using the chat a lot. And then also if you just have a text editor open so that you can use that, not necessarily to take notes, but just to do some of the writing activities that we're going to be going through. And that's going to be about just starting to get the sense of crafting a portfolio story and telling the story of your work and using that story to guide how you design your portfolio and how you start going about planning that portfolio. So let me go into sharing my screen. Okay. All right. And let me grab, so I have to bring some things over here. Just give me 1 second to kind of reformat. So I'm working with 2 different screens, so I have to kind of drag things over. And okay, so can people see the screen? Is it somewhere here? Oh, also, yes, this is the first time I've done this through Zoom. So it's a little bit of a learning process for me as well. A lot of times I'm just used to, working more with people in person. Obviously that's not possible, but figuring this out as everyone is. And I think going into this, before we get into the specifics of this, just one of these considerations to think about is just, with the pandemic, and obviously that's changing the way that a lot of us are working right now. A lot of us are learning and teaching, and it's also really changing the way that people are applying for jobs and are proposing exhibitions and projects. And so this is something, as we are talking about the portfolio and this process, there's another thing to consider, which is that as we are moving into kind of the next phase of things with the pandemic, a lot of businesses are not going to go back to the way that things were. There's not going to be this going back to this normal kind of business as usual. And so I think that we're going to see a lot of shifts in terms of how people apply for jobs, how people talk about their work, present their work, and then of course how work actually happens and how this maybe is going to change workplace environments. And so all that's going to impact the way that we might go about creating these different portfolio elements. And this is all just happening right now. So it's a really exciting time. And it's also just this time where as we're going through this and moving through this, some of these conventions might be really shifting, and more so than how they maybe have in the past. Things are happening a lot faster. So that's just it's just kind of like a larger thing to think about as we're going into this. So yes, crafting a portfolio story. And so this is kind of the conceptual part of this workshop series, and looking at, how do we start? How do we think about these first kind of architectures, and what exactly is a portfolio, and what are the purposes they serve? So going through here, this is kind of this is definitely a question of design. We're talking about form and function. So a lot of times, when you're talking about design, you have the form of something, what it looks like, the physical attributes, and then the function it performs. And then those two things are really related. So before we start thinking about the specifics of a portfolio, and as we're starting to conceptualize the design, I think it would be great to just hear from folks, what kind of forms do you see a portfolio taking on? how would you describe a portfolio? And so this is a great time for chat. I want to definitely, I'm going to put these into this set of slides so that folks can kind of reference it after. So when you think about a portfolio, just, you know, what form does that take on in your head? What do you imagine it as being?
Well, doesn't the word portfolio come from having a folder that opens up and you have all of your paper art or images and photographs displayed physically? But this is no longer the best method.
Yes, yeah. So it does come from this physical object, where it is this portfolio where you would have pieces. And I think I applied to undergrad with that actual physical thing. It was very big. I had to carry it around to, they would call them portfolio days. And we'd go to different schools, just like lugging around this huge thing. And then we have some great things in the chat. So a collection of artworks by theme, a place where employers can see my best work. That's a interesting one. Yes, that's starting to bring in the function as well. Representation of your artistry. Great. Combination of your artistic accomplishments. Organized and show the best work. First neutral work, and then another best work. Real, yes. So this is getting into, we have, you know, when we think portfolio and going back to that physical, those physical origins, you know, you have, you're thinking, okay, images, and a lot of times still images, but then you also have this real. So that is for folks that are working with animation, film, installations that potentially are kinetic and moving. Also, any kind of performance art, site-specific art, where you have people interacting with an installation or a space. Slideshows, so that is showing a series of images and potentially also videos and animations in succession. An array of images on a website. Yes, ooh, array. I like that term. Slide inventory with descriptions and information. Let me see if I'm missing any. A website with the projects I'm most proud of. And so we start to see these different forms, this idea of a collection, this idea of a library, an archive, and a place or a site where folks can view your work, a representation. So these things that are, again, these are all kind of based and rooted in this potential physical understanding of these visuals. And then now we're shifting them into the online space. All right, any other ideas about form? Okay, I'm gonna definitely be inputting these. Okay, and then so with function, so what is the purpose of these? Why do we have portfolios? And there's, I think, you know, with a lot of objects, they can serve multiple functions. So how do we use these? Representation for potential employers. Awards, fellowships, yeah. So, and great, exhibitions, document your progress, yes. Networking for sure, yeah. Reaching out to folks. There's a social aspect that can happen with these sites. Attract recruiters, apply for work, quick overview of your work. Great. So yeah, and then I mean, I think that these they're all of course related purposes. You have this idea of using these for potential employers. You're trying to represent yourself as an artist as well. And I think that this is where you have these portfolios that are serving these multiple functions. And this, I think, can be an element of that anxiety, because you're like, okay, so I'm going to be applying to lots of different jobs potentially, and I'm going to have different employers looking at this. So I have different audience there. But then if I'm also using this just to represent myself as an artist, that's you're suddenly shifting that, because then your audience is going to be maybe a different type of viewer than an employer. So you're starting to think about, okay, so now I'm going to have to present two potential ways of looking at this site and interacting with this site. I want this to be about myself and about my artwork and my work as a creative person. But then I'm also trying to market this to a specific audience in some situations. So I want an employer to be able to look at this, and I want to be able to market my skills, my techniques, the work that I'm creating. And then you have awards and fellowships, and that is a slightly different audience than what you might be having with potential employers. Exhibitions, that's another area where you might be applying to have your work exhibited within a space or at a conference. And so though that audience is going to be different as well. So, and then there's also this idea of this documentation. So you have, and this is where, as you're documenting your work, and this is a really a big part of being a practicing artist, a practicing creative person, is that you have the actual creation of the work, but then you want to be able to document it for yourself and create that collection and create that library so that you can see your progress and so that you can see how you are moving as an artist, growing as an artist. And I think that there can be a lot of really great exploration and potential that comes from that. And so you have this as like another, this is another function of a portfolio. So that this is completely for yourself as a practicing artist or designer or creative. How you are organizing your work to look through, how you might be responding to past projects, how you might look at past projects and use them to inform or inspire what you might be doing next. And that's another really useful function of a portfolio. And then you also have this idea of time and interaction. Sometimes you want to be able to have someone look at it, look at a portfolio and get an idea of your work very quickly. Sometimes you want folks to be doing a more close reading of your work. And so you have lots and lots of different audiences and lots of different potential audiences and a lot of different uses. And they are definitely related, but they're also distinct in some ways. And so this, I think, all kind of goes into the anxiety and just kind of the feelings of being really overwhelmed when it comes to planning out this portfolio, because it's about yourself, it's about your representation, it's about your work, and then it's also kind of linked to all of these different audiences and potential uses. And it can be really hard to kind of narrow that down into something that feels very focused, I guess. And I think that when you're planning these things out, that you want to be able to include everything. And so I think that there tends to be a lack of focus and a lack of that a sense of direction with this. And so what we're doing today with this workshop is thinking about how we can create that focus and what we might want that focus to center around. So using this Another way to think about a portfolio is it's both a container and then a communicator. So you have the contents, and that is your creative work. And that's actually going to be the thing that we're focusing on the least with this series of workshops, because these are the things that you are going to be constantly working on. You're constantly making new things, and so that's going to be something that is kind of generating on its own. So what we're going to be more focused on is the container that you're putting those contents in, and then also what that container is communicating. So we have, the contents, and then it goes into a container, and that also, how it's organized within that container. I'm using a very simple model here, so it's just one thing. So we're going to get into organization a little bit later, but then that communication aspect, how is this branded? How are we describing these contents? What is the story of these contents? That also is a huge part of the portfolio. And that's what we are going to be focusing on with this first workshop. And so again, thinking about this as a package, something that is kind of relating back to this physical sense, we're thinking about what factors into packaging design. So we have the contents, we have the target audience, and then we have the brand. And this is, very kind of basic package design, physical package design. You're thinking about what is within that package. You're thinking about who you are trying to communicate that information to, and then how you are communicating that information. And that is also what you want to be thinking about with your portfolio. And so what happens, I think, a lot of times when we're thinking about this focus, and I mean, and this is something that I, having made many portfolios, and also having worked with a lot of artists and other designers with their portfolio, that communication, I think it starts at this idea of description, where it's like this wanting to be really objective, thinking like, okay, my work can speak for itself, and it needs to be, I just am going to take this very kind of objective, descriptive approach when I'm talking about my work. And I think that a lot of times is how people first try to build that focus in. And the problem with that is that when you're thinking about that description, you lose that sense of that audience. And then I think that it really kind of disconnects the artist from the artwork, and the creator from whatever creative output you're working with. And so this is just a quick example, going back to that idea of ice cream. So we have description, and it can just be, details as objective as possible: frozen organic ice cream, sugar and chocolate, made in Santa Cruz. And I think that you want to contrast that and think about, instead of this idea of description, instead of this objective approach, you have this idea of story. And the story is more than just a description. The story is thinking about your audience, and it's also connecting the creator yourself back with the work. So you have the story: locally sourced organic ice cream, sugar and fresh seasonal ingredients go into each scoop of our small batch recipes. So this is essentially telling you the same information as this list of ingredients, but it's also crafting that. It's telling a story instead of just communicating information. And that, as much as we want our creative work to be able to speak for itself, it's something that you very rarely can you disconnect and separate the artist from the artwork. And so with our portfolios, I think it's important to focus on that story, and to allow that story, and then the story of that creative approach, your story as the artist and as the creator, allow that to guide your design of your portfolio. So this is, I'm going to have a series of propositions with this workshop. And so none of this is to say like, this is the one way to do this. This is the one approach. But these are just things to consider. And these are things that I found have been really helpful in designing portfolios and in creating portfolio sites that really tell the story of your work. And so I think that story, and this is again just a proposition, but this idea that story is as important as creative content. So there is this focus a lot of times. You want to get all your projects in there. You're thinking about all your projects, and then you're thinking about the way that that portfolio might look. You're thinking about the framing. You're thinking about maybe colors and text and font. And then the story is kind of the last thing a lot of times I think that goes into that portfolio. And I really want to flip that and think about story as being as important about the creative content. So you have this idea that the presentation, how you talk about your work is really going to shape the way that work is perceived. And so you have presentation shaping understanding. So that story, the story of the work is really shaping the way that the audience understands it. And that is another kind of proposition that I have, where instead of trying to build a portfolio site that fits every one of your pieces of artwork and that fits also all of your intended audiences and all of the intended uses, you're creating a portfolio site that tells the story of your work. And I think that can be a different approach, and it can allow you to have a lot more freedom in terms of actually creating a narrative that that the audience can kind of follow along with. And this idea of audience is also really important with the portfolio sites, because, you know, in a situation like this, I can, you know, walk folks through slides and visuals, and I can talk about my work. And that, of course, at some point in an interview process, or if you're applying for a grant, you can do that. You will be able to do that. You'll be able to either have like a in-person interview or a Zoom interview. But before that, a lot of times is, you know, just submitting your portfolio site, just submitting a personal statement. And so in that situation, the role of the presenter really shifts. And so that's another thing that we want to consider when we're thinking about portfolio designs. There is a relationship between the author or the creator and then the audience and the user. And so when you're working with a portfolio site, there's that level of interaction. And all of you who are AGPM folks, anyone who's working with interactive media, it really kind of changes the relationship between the viewer, and it can change that viewer into a user, and that there is kind of a level of authorship that comes into that. So when you give the user or the audience or the viewer the ability to make choices, they start to impact the narrative. And so that's when you want to think about using the story to guide that interaction. And this goes back to thinking about interactive works, playable media. There's always, you want to have a strong story behind your mechanics. You want to have a story driving your games. You want to have that narrative. That narrative is what is influencing different player choices. And so this is the same thing with portfolios. You know, thinking about the story is driving the way that a potential audience, a potential user is going to be navigating your work. Okay, so this brings us to the portfolio triad and just this idea of, what actually goes into the design of a portfolio. What are the major considerations that you want to be thinking about? And so another way to think about this, so we've looked at that idea of a package that has contents, and then the actual container that the contents go into, and then the communication element, the package design. So that's for, this one physical object. And then we can start to extend another metaphor with a visual collection. So thinking about a space that holds creative artworks, essentially like a gallery or an exhibition space. So you have the artworks themselves, you have the images, you have the framing. So how each image is presented, what kind of frames are they in? Where are they on the wall? What kind of information is provided with each of those images? How are they ordered? How many are in each room? And then you also have the architecture, and that is the way that physical space is constructed, how it is designed, how it is organized. And that architecture is what impacts the navigation. So someone's going through that gallery space, and if there's only one doorway to lead on to the next room, and then you get into the next room and there's only one doorway to lead on to the next room, that is a very directed space. So the viewer, the person, can only go one way or the other. But as soon as you put in two different doors, then that person can make a choice, and so they can branch off. And so that architecture, the way that building, the way that space is designed, is going to impact navigation. And so this is something that, again, I think because it isn't this visual thing, it's something that a lot of times is overlooked with portfolio design. And it is very, very important. So thinking about the story, the work, and the framing, if you have these three things kind of overlapping and they're all equally weighted, then the issue is that the sweet spot of the portfolio is just, it's minimal, and I think that this is kind of this approach that I think at first, trying to think about these things all evenly. And a lot of times I think that the work and the framing are even kind of a larger consideration than the story when people are approaching these for the first time. And so you have, we're not sure which thing is leading. Is the work leading? Is the framing leading? How the portfolio actually looks, how it appears, the menu systems, all of those things, like what kind of banner images you're using. These are the things that I think we tend to focus on. And then the story can sometimes fall into the background. And what I propose, and I think another way to approach this is to think about the story is directing all of these other things. So you have the majority of the portfolio is that work, but it is being shaped by the architecture and the framing. It is being shaped by how it's being presented, and also the way that the user is able to navigate the work. And then that can be shaped by the overall story and narrative. How do you want the audience to interact with the artworks and with the creative works that you are showing? And so, and I like to think about this as like exploding the about section. About sections are great with portfolios, but I do think that they tend to create this false separation between the person who's making the work, the creator, and then the work itself. And so it's, thinking again, if you're approaching something and it's work driven or project driven, you have, I think it just, that kind of just automatically creates this sense of the separation. I want my work to speak for itself. I don't want to be having to explain my work. And I think that there's an element to that makes sense, because you want folks to be able to understand your projects without a lot of explanation and exposition, but the idea that you can separate yourself, I think, kind of detracts from overall the story that you can tell. And so you want to think about this instead. It can still be project focused, but you are also bringing in your story into each of those projects, and you're not separating out yourself as the maker with your work. Oops. All right. So this goes into defining a narrative. And this is where we're going to start having folks, think about their own approaches to their work, and then how they can kind of build out a narrative that can speak for your work. This is challenging, but it's also a fun exercise. And I think in doing all of these things, it's about this exploration and about this explorative process. And so in thinking about these things, it might not be something where it's like, okay, I'm done, I have figured this out, but it's just that exercise that I think can really start to help shape your ideas and your story around your work and the narrative around your work. So thinking about, who are you as a creative person? Who are you as an artist? Who are you as a designer? And then how does this inform your work? How are these two things connected? Okay, and then I'm going to hopefully see if this stops working. Okay, can people see the thing that says RT Bollocks? Yes, okay, great, thank you. Okay, so this is a little exercise. This is a artist statement generator, and the authors of these I think are interesting because bollocks is kind of like gobbledygook. So, basically saying like, here's a bunch of words and it doesn't have any meaning. And yes, because when you're working with a generator, none of these things are actually connected to you. But this, I think what's interesting about this is that it's showing the different types of narratives that can actually generate from these very short statements. And they might be really a little bit ridiculous and random, but as you're going through these, I think it can be so helpful to think about the narratives that they can generate, because you have a very short statement here. So we have a short artist statement. So these are things that are randomly generated. They're just pulling from, I think, just some different random lists and then essentially mad-libbing them. So we have as shifting phenomena become reconfigured through emergent and repetitive practice, the viewer is left with a hymn to the darkness of our world. Okay, obviously this isn't connected to anything that you are doing, but there's a narrative there. And it's a short sentence, it's a single sentence, but then think about the story that kind of expands behind it. What kind of story is this telling here? So then it says not arty enough. So this generates another one with influences as diverse as Kierkegaard and Roy Lichtenstein. New synergies are manufactured from both constructed and discovered textures. It's an interesting one. Ever since I was a postgraduate, I have been fascinated by the essential unreality of relationships. So these are these short artistic statements, but they're telling a story. And you can craft a much larger story and a much larger narrative than what exists just within these words and within this single sentence. So this is just going to say, like, this is kind of an exercise in absurdity, and it's this kind of exquisite corpse of like these kind of randomly put together ideas, but these can generate narratives. And so this is just an example of how you can create a narrative that can become the focus of your site, but it doesn't necessarily have to limit your site. It just gives you that through line to be able to work from and to be able to expand from. So this is just another one. What starts out as yearning soon becomes manipulated into a dialectic of temptation, leaving only a sense of failing and the possibility of a new order. And then you can even come down here to Bollock's buzzwords, a carnival of defeat, prospect of a new reality, traditional understanding of the universe, subtle phenomena become frozen. So again, these are just randomly chosen words, buzzwords that are put together in ways that create these different grammars, but you can generate a story out of each of these. And even though that's only 4 or 5 words, it can apply to a lot of different narratives. The darkness of our world. Synergies are generated. So I think that this is a fun narrative exercise where you start to see how you can have a very short, you can have a very, a very concise narrative statement and narrative idea, but that can expand into a much larger narrative world and possibility space. Okay, so let me go back here. I think. Okay. So, for narrative building, step 1, brainstorming. And I think we could do maybe 5 minutes with this. Just creating 3 different lists of words to define and describe the following. So what do you create in one list? How do you create those things in another list? And then why do you create? And so just single words or phrases, but these 3 different lists. And then we're going to use these things to generate a narrative statement. So these are things that that are specific to you as an artist and a creative, and then the works that you are creating. And definitely get specific with these too. So, what do you create? Artworks. What types of artworks? So I think, yeah, I can maybe just take 5 minutes to do this, and I will turn off the audio on my end of things. And then if anyone has any questions though, let me know, and you can also send it to the chat or just to me. And then we're going to come back and think about creating some very short artist statements. Okay, so some great question that I just want to verbalize in case folks are not able to keep track of the chat and your lists, which is totally understandable. The question was, is the how do you create supposed to be more philosophical, or is it the tools you use? And so I mean, obviously there's going to be some overlap with these questions, and that's okay. This is really just trying to, create some very broad categories. But I was thinking of the how being more about tools, techniques, processes. But the philosophical components could be under the why. What is motivating you to create work, other than I have to do it for my class. So as folks are finishing that up, I just want to go to the next step of this, which is starting to craft that narrative statement. So looking at those lists, circle or bold, 2 to 3 words in each list that you think apply to your work the most. And this, again, can always go back and change these or experiment with different words. And in some cases, you might be creating 1 or 2 or 3 of these different statements. And it's this, again, it's really about this exercise of exploring, what the story is behind your work, and just trying to define that. And it might not be possible to do in a single sentence, but this is what we're going to try. So so with those 3 lists, you're going to create a 1-sentence portfolio story statement that addresses the what, the how, and the why from these circled words. And yes, it can be a run-on sentence. And just thinking about that expansion, narrative expansion we were looking at before, how much of a world can you build with 1 or 2 sentences? And so let's do that for another 5 minutes. So I will mute myself again. Okay, so Alex, don't worry about sending that actually, because I was just about to ask folks to share if you feel comfortable. So I won't read that one out loud unless you are okay with that. But
Sure.
okay, great. Yeah.
Yeah,
So we have character, environment, UI design, modeling, surfacing texture in Blender, Maya, Unity, to prove that anyone can be an artist if they put their minds to it. Okay, so I think that that story, so we have the content, right? You know, UI design, character environment design, modeling, surfacing, those are the specifics. You're talking about some of the programs that you use, and then, but then that's that statement to prove that anyone can be an artist if they put their minds to it. So that is a story. That can be something that you can communicate, that can bring all of your work together.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That
So-
wasn't my full sentence, though. Do you want me to quote my?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
I'll just type it up.
My work focuses on fiction, world building, and creative solid narratives using various writing and editing softwares and sheer self-motivation to convey to others the same things that I myself enjoy. So that's another example where we have these specifics and then this idea of sheer self-motivation that, yeah, I mean, I think that is telling a story, you know, that, I mean, I think all of us who are in this world, we know that there can be a lot of challenge that comes with being a creative and to producing work. And so we have that grit, that self-motivation, but then also you have that joy in there as well. So these are, you know, why you're doing this. It can be hard, but then you also have that joy that's in there. So that's telling the story of your work. That's telling the story of you as an artist. Design games that bring out important qualities such as positivity, systemically balanced and memorable fun through technologies such as Unity and Unreal Engine, in goals to create games that are safe and inclusive to all. Great. So you have, this is where you're tying in this idea of yourself as an artist, how your work is shaped. What are the things that are shaping that work? And then that's coming out to the user, to the audience. They're understanding how you're. Oh, I think someone is not muted. Does someone have a question or accidental unmute? Okay. So that's where you want to bring that passion in there. You want to bring those inspirations in there, those goals in there. Creating balanced games, accessible games, inclusive games. That's another thing that you really want to communicate to someone who's looking at your portfolio. And in doing that, it can really help define those goals for yourself as well. Write and create comics as a way to communicate and share what I and most of my readers may be feeling so we can better understand each other. Great. That idea of understanding, that idea of communicating ideas that are shared, creating a sense of community. As an artist, I primarily focus on creating digital art, new media, sculpture, and creative writing through the use of digital tools and softwares like Photoshop and the natural environment around me in order to develop an attachment through introspection where it has once been severed in childhood. So this is taking on a more serious and thoughtful direction. And that, again, you know, all of these things are so important to communicate. Because that is what is shaping your work. It's already shaping your work. You have these narratives and these stories that are already shaping your work. So the more that you can define those for the viewer, the better that they're going to understand your work the way that you want it to be understood and to be seen. And so this, again, as we're thinking about this, especially as a tool for employment, as a tool for self-promotion, essentially, you know, you're having to brand your work and use it in this kind of commercial aspect, you want to have control of that narrative. And the other thing is that you want a potential employer to be seeing your work, but then you also want them to be seeing you and identifying you, because they are looking at so many examples of work. They're just seeing so much work, so much work, so much work. They could probably find like the specifics of a project. If they're only looking at visuals, they're going to find something that fits their visuals. They can find that perfectly, but you don't want it to be about them finding exactly what they're looking for in one of your projects. You want them to be finding who they're looking for in you and yourself as a creative. And so you want to be presenting yourself, your role as a creative, your role as an artist with your work, because that's what's going to become the most memorable thing. An employer is not going to, they're not going to decide on a person based on an artwork. That of course is going to be, a huge factor, but they're also thinking about the person behind that, the person who's making that. And also just kind of being able to see, the potential, what you have to offer, what you have to bring. If the more that you can talk about that and tell that story through your portfolio, instead of having it to be tied to specific works, the less that each of those works the less work each of those projects or each of those examples have to do. Going through a couple more of these. I create orchestral, jazz, and acoustic music through the use of software instruments. My goal is to simply become the best composer I can be. So you have that idea of, again, that self-motivation, pushing yourself. And I would also encourage you to think about, you want to be the best composer, but what does that sound like? What types of, what does that sound like for the audience? And maybe just be a little bit more specific with that. Maybe what are some of the inspirations you're pulling from? How would you define like being the best at something? See, my work revolves around digital art, characters, and 2D assets made by using a Sketch and Adobe Photoshop applications. I create these pieces of work to practice my skills, experiment with styles and ideas, and to be a part of something bigger, such as video games. Great, yeah. So that idea of experimentation, exploration, being a part of a community, these are great themes to look at. That idea of working in a project group or a team, that's something that, you can't really show that in a visual or a still from a game. I mean, you can definitely walk through that when you're describing something, but that's where you want to bring in that story. If you are someone that's really community driven, team focused, and you're applying to a studio that works with a lot of teams, and most of them do, then highlight that, because that is an asset. That being able to work creatively as a team, to be able to fit into a certain studio culture, those are things that employers are looking for. Hard surface character. Oh, it's back to Alex's. The work ranges from character to environment to UI design. Moreover, the tools I use to create are Blender's modeling, surfacing, and texture tools, but ultimately do this to prove that if I could be an artist, then so can you. So, I mean, this idea of making things more accessible, and maybe your approach is to create visuals that are achievable, and maybe you are you're trying to create a visual vocabulary that is accessible to more people, and so those are things that you could be exploring. Hard surface 3D art assets modeled in Blender and Substance Painter by studying form, perspective, and scale with the intention to facilitate an experience. So great. Think about what type of experience you're trying to facilitate. Realistic experience, immersive experience, compelling experience. And then this, I think, is a great example of a story that might be a little bit more technically focused, and that's okay. And if you are someone that is really interested in looking at a very specific process, or you're working with a very kind of a slightly more defined practice. So let's say that you're really just engaged with like 3D modeling and character design, and so that's really what your interest is. So get into those specifics if you have them, and it's okay to focus on those technical things. Just get into the details of those, and try to still bring in, like, why are you doing this? What is that inspiration? Why are you so interested in creating into this very specific into this focus? See, my art stems from anything that fuels my curiosity. My goal is always to share my imagination with the world. Great. So this is definitely coming from a place that's a little more curious. You have a playful standpoint here, and just let's, I think it's interesting to just, compare and contrast these. Each of, Ethan versus Joshua, these statements, they're really, when you think about them, they're telling different stories, and then that is good. Because we want, you want your story to be about your work and yourself as an artist. My work is hollow realist paintings inspired by natural colorants that ingress supernatural emotions. Very cool. All right, going through a couple more of these. I'm probably not going to be able to go through each of these. Let's see here. Using tools like dot picked and Photoshop. I love telling visual stories through original characters and designs. I want to create things that people can enjoy and to represent who I am. And that idea of representation and identification, that can be a big element of creating work, being an artist, being a designer. It doesn't always have to be, but if you do find yourself, seeking out this type of representation, tying in your identity, expressing your identity, that self-expression as part of your art practice, then you definitely want to talk about that. That's something that you want to put out there for people to see and to explore with your portfolio. As an artist and musician, I often listen to the sounds of music forming a cinematic in my mind that I must bring to reality using Photoshop. Hoping these characteristics transition well into video games, music, like art, has a story that I seek to bring to life. So very clear goal, but there's so much expansion that can happen there. This idea of music, like art, has a story, and you seek to bring that to life. That is such a nice kind of through line to have throughout your entire portfolio, and that's something that can be attached to a lot of your projects. Probably you don't have to necessarily spell it out in each of them, but if it's there at the beginning, and if that's the thing that you are bringing the viewer into with, then it sticks with them as they're navigating through all of your work, and so they're remembering that, as long as that's what you are kind of showing them first. I like this. My goal is to create something unique and hilarious, yet deep. I think that's very possible. I want to make games that allow us to share the experiences and feelings that we find difficult to express with words. I want to make players feel both delighted and safe to be themselves. And I think that will be, I just want to talk about that because it really hits upon something that that I think is important to consider going forward. We have this idea of, I think a lot of art, and especially when you're working with interactive art, playable media, film, visuals. It's this idea that you're wanting to create this experience for the viewer and the audience, something that is difficult to express with words. And that is, and that's, I think as visual creative folks, or, with music, there's meaning that comes from interactions as well. All of these things, it's this idea that words can't describe that experience. And I think that that's totally true. And I think that, but when we're thinking about a portfolio, I think a lot of times the idea of a story and then the idea of words kind of get conflated. And so we might not be able to truly, use words only to describe these narratives, but we can use them to create this kind of one statement that we can build on with the visuals. And that's what we're going to be looking at after today. Okay, and then this last one here. I'm a passionate artist and anthropologist specializing in graphic design and illustration. I'm inspired by diverse cultures and thrive in spaces where I showcase inclusive voices through playful artistic visuals and creative storytelling. Great, yes. And I think it's this idea of telling these stories and this sharing and this communication. I think these are all great things to focus on through a portfolio. All right. So definitely save these. And again, I'm going to, I think we're saving the chat, but you'll be drawing from these and further kind of developing them outside of this. I totally understand, it's like, oh, it's a Friday. And so, trying to be creative and think about this and get this focused in a workshop setting, sometimes it doesn't work. So, start with what you have and then maybe take some space from it, think about it over the next week, and then you can continue to develop these or experiment with different statements. Okay. And so then the last part and the last kind of part of this workshop is just looking at how we start to implement this narrative. How do we start to use it and convey it in our portfolios? How do we tell this story when you're working with the constraints of a website, essentially? Okay, so, and this is all, we're talking about this outside of your actual work. And that is, again, something you're constantly building, you're constantly creating work. And so you don't want to think about a portfolio site as being specific to projects. You don't want to be building around, let's say you have 5 projects and you build your portfolio around those 5 projects. What happens in, next quarter or a year when suddenly you've created something that is totally different. So you really want to be thinking about the architecture of the site itself first, and then how your work can fit into that once you've created that architecture that is organizing that work. So with this conversation, we're not really talking about your actual work. We're just talking about everything else. So we have the text of the portfolio. And so that's everything from obviously descriptions, any kind of bio text that you have, sentences, menu titles, the title of your site. All those things have to do with text, and those can all influence the narrative and the story that you tell. We have the framing, and so that's what I like to think of as the design. And of course, all of this, there's a little bit of overlap. The framing, though, the colors of the site, the font choices, the size of the text and the titles, things like little details, logos, where things are organized within the page, that kind of form of your site. All those things influence the narrative and can influence the meaning and the way that your work is seen. And then you also have the user experience. the way that the viewer navigates through your site. And that is determined by the architecture of the site. That is determined by, there's ways to control and constrain those interactions. And you want to think about that as this sense of this narrative design. Okay, so I wanted to just do a quick exercise with these. So I have here, let's see here. Let me jump to this as well. Okay. So I have 3 kind of sample sites right here, and they're all working with the same set of images. And I just wanted to show 3 different approaches that's working with different framing, and also starting to work with different architecture. This is only the landing page essentially. And going through these, I just want you, as we're going through these, thinking about how each of these different narratives might be different. Might be different, yes. How are they different? What might be the narrative statement for each of these sites? And as you're thinking about that, and maybe jotting those down, think about what are the visual aspects, what are the framing aspects that direct that narrative, that maybe change that narrative. So we have this one, conservation co-op. We have a couple of different options in the landing page. We don't have a lot of textual information, but we're seeing a lot of different images. And it looks like we're able to choose from all these different images, and seeing all these images together, seeing all this work together is definitely, that's changing something, right? So as the user, I am saying, okay, I can come up here and go to these 2 different options. I have this looks like the current project, obviously, because January 2021. But then we have past adventures. And then I'm just seeing a big range of work here. And then you go to, not this one. Hold on here. Okay. So then you have the Conservation Collective. And this, you're seeing less options, and the design seems a little bit less minimal, or is a little bit more minimal. So you don't have those bright colors in the framing. They're still within the photos though. We're getting a little bit more information here. And then seeing the way that they're animating, the way that they're laid out together. It's less images, maybe a more focused set of images. And then we have a couple of more options up here. And then we have this one. So here's the conservation core. The font's a little bit different. We have a single image, more text. We're able to jump to recent expeditions. And then we're getting a little bit more information about what this organization might be about, even though, and then it's just a single image. And then that's also stylized a little bit very differently than these ones. So in looking at these, I'm just interested, what are some observations? How are people responding to these? And I think everyone's going to respond to things differently. So there isn't, you can't determine the exact narrative that every viewer and every audience, potential target audience, is going to take. But I think it can be really helpful in looking at these different examples. Just how do these different visual elements, how do these different ways of starting these narratives, how do these different navigation elements and architectures and this different framing, how does that all impact the initial narrative that you're getting from each of these different sites? So yeah, the last one feels more personal, so that this one might be speaking to a more singular audience, or it might be more about a single person's work or vision. Third one, the best, feels more decisive, if that makes sense. Yes, definitely. And I think that this one is a little bit more direct. There's less opportunity for the user to make choices. There's less different options for them to look at from the beginning. And so that is one way to approach this type of narrative design. We have lack of context from the first two is impactful. Makes you feel like you're looking at someone's image or album. Yes. And I think that is, something to consider. This is how, if you're just seeing the image, what does that do? How does that change things for you as a user? I mean, and that, it might be something that you want to give the user and the audience a lot of different things to see at first. You want to show that you have a big variety of work. And that really is just about your difference in narrative design and your different approach with this and how you want the user to be able to interact with the artworks. Purposeful, great, yeah. Yeah, I think that's great. This is just the first one. It's the idea of emphasizing the visuals of the work, the idea of adventure. And then, so think about that. So we have this idea of adventure. The bold color might be something that is being used in that intentional way. And then you have a lot of different options. You're encouraging, it's more of an open format, an open narrative. You're encouraging the user to, click on a number of images. And then you have the second one, the idea of it being seen as more informative. Sorry about the tracking. I think they were setting up like a bait something because they're tracking wolverines, but then a lot of times they have to use roadkill. So I did not realize how gory that was last night when I was making this. So this one you have, it's a little bit more straightforward. You still have options, but you're getting information under each of these images. You have a little bit more of a narrative to choose from. Things are being presented a little bit more linearly. And then this one is definitely, it has a stronger, I would say, and someone else used the word purposeful viewpoint. So it is, it has a very kind of specific style. And then, so that gives it its own experience. And this is probably the most directive of the narratives. It has the most constraints for the user. Yeah. And so we have this idea, I think there's a lot of different kind of feelings being conveyed in these images, and they might tell more of a story than this, the first one, just because they are presented in a more linear way. Yeah. So, and this is, of course, this is very limited to just some initial designs, but I do think that this is a really good exploration of how the work itself, that's, that is showing one thing. And that is, but when you have, it's the layout, the way it's being presented, the framing, the architecture, the options that you give the users, that really impacts the narrative as well. And it really impacts the way that a person might see and understand the work. And so each of these different formats, each of these different architectures is telling a different story, even though they're working with the same content. And that is what we are trying to do. Once you have that narrative, you're going to be thinking about framing that reinforces that narrative. You're going to be thinking about text, word choice, even things like what you're naming the menus. You have latest expeditions, journal, contact, subtitles and titles, these types of taglines. Like all of these things are going to influence the meaning. What if this was latest photographs versus latest expeditions? Like that really changes the way that someone might approach and see this work. Okay, so this is what also, just looking at these different mechanics, right now we're kind of exploring like, how you might be responding to them, how these can be used to create a sense of narrative. And then next, in the next workshop, we're going to be looking at that, those specifics a little bit more from a technical aspect. How do we choose a platform, looking at different fonts, different backgrounds, different templates, and how those might influence the way that our work is perceived. Okay. And so I think we'll skip that. So then the last part of today, I just want to talk about this idea of narrative structure. And so this would be the user experience and the user interface, the architecture of the site, designing that space. I think it's very useful to start approaching this once you have a narrative, once you have that narrative design and that statement that you want to use to shape your work. This is when we start planning out like how you might communicate that narrative to the user using the narrative structure of the site. So a couple of different examples of different structures. So you have a linear structure. And this is where, these are essentially just story maps, narrative maps. And this is also, thinking about this in a physical space. This is like a building that only has one door in, one door out. So you can move forward into a space and you can move back, but you can't jump from one to another. You don't have a lot of choices to make. And you're basically going forwards or backwards. And then we have a really open structure. And I think this is where originally portfolios, it was like, okay, we want to give, and just website design in general, we wanted to give the user all of the choices all the time. So there weren't a lot of hierarchies. You had like menus and you maybe have sub menus, but this idea of this home page, and then you jump into like a different section, project list, expedition list. I can be in the project list and then be in the sub menu of like all the projects. And then I can jump to the about page, and then I can jump to the contact page. And there's just this completely open structure. And so you can also, this is kind of the, parallels this idea of like totally open sandbox games and media, where without a narrative design, there are a lot of narratives that you could potentially miss out on. And I think that when the technology for websites was first being developed and people were first starting to work with it, and this is going into the early 2000s, we wanted to give the user the primary authorship role. We wanted them to be able to have complete control. And unfortunately, I think that there's a little bit of a detraction with that, because it's very hard to tell a story with a completely open structure. It's very hard to tell a specific narrative. Even if it's a very loose narrative, it's hard to do that when the user has complete choice and there's no constraints. So this is something that has really changed as websites and technologies have evolved. The way that things are being designed has really started to change, and the way that we approach these science has really changed. And I think it started to shift, and definitely has shifted, at least in the last 5 to 10 years, into more of a branching structure. And so this is where you have options and menus that people can access, but there's different hierarchies with those things that are kind of global. And then you're also wanting to bring the user in. You give them some choices, but then create these branching narratives where you are directing some of the decisions, but then you're still crafting them. So the user will come into whatever you want to see them to see first, and then they can choose, are they going to go in this direction or this direction? And then once they do that, they're kind of on a different pathway. And there's always ways to kind of connect back, but you want to be crafting these different pathways. And that, I think, is also, it's a lot, this can be something that is a lot more accessible to a wider audience. And the way that this is not totally random is that you're thinking about the stories that you're telling. You're thinking about that narrative that you're using to shape these different trajectories. So, thinking about this as essentially as narrative design within a game. It's not totally a sandbox, but you're giving the user enough of a choice that they are going down different narrative paths, but those narratives all relate back to that central idea, that central theme of your work. Okay. And so I think, oh yeah, and then just to go back to this really, just to talk about this structure a little bit more. So this is essentially storyboarding. And with all of the web applications that we have now, these are things that have really, these designs are being utilized by a lot of different sites and platforms. So things like Airbnb, Uber, obviously like different social media platforms. You have, instead of, being able to do everything, like you go onto Airbnb, it isn't like, it's like you have every single option available to you. They have, they ask you questions like, where do you want to go? When do you want to go? What are you looking for? Okay. And then they give you like more things. Once you have made those choices, they bring you to this point, and then they can give you other options. But these are, they are directing that experience a lot more than, 15 years ago, where you maybe would have gotten to a homepage that's like dates, place, available properties, like all of those menu options kind of more equally available. And so less of kind of a storyboard or an experience for that user, with that user in mind. So this definitely is a type of design that expands beyond just portfolios. And so for this next week, as you're working with your personal statements, I think also just what you want to do before we start looking at platform specifics and we start getting into the templates and working with the templates, you want to create a storyboard. You want to have that plan and that architecture, at least ideally, before you start looking at individual platforms and before you start looking at individual templates. So how would you want a viewer to navigate your site? How directed do you want things to be? How many choices do you want to give the viewer? And how many things do you want to be able to control? And then where does the narrative branch out? What is choice-based, and then what is predetermined? And so you want to be thinking about, the content that you have to put in. How do you want that organized? How do you want to guide the user through that? And build out that map before you start looking at examples, before you start looking at potential templates to use, because that you want to be going from that background, from that plan, from that foundation. All right, and so for next time, workshop 2, so continue to develop your portfolio story summary, complete your portfolio story map, and then we'll be exploring Squarespace, WordPress, and Wix, and going into actually looking at Squarespace, and then I'll be doing some tutorials on how to work with that and different considerations to think about when you're choosing a different template, and then also just looking at how to actually start setting those things up and bringing your work and content into that. So yeah, I think that is it. I wanted to have the last to the last 20 minutes for any questions from folks. Yes. Great. Next event. Cargo. I will look into cargo more for sure. And I think that my issue with the Adobe Portfolio website is I just can't separate it from Dreamweaver. But I do think that there are some considerations to when you're choosing those different platforms, and I can definitely get into that more. And really, it just does. It really just is about what works best for you ultimately, and how you can most easily communicate your story. So just because I'm going to be focusing on some of these platforms, and I have my own, reasons for doing that, I don't want folks to feel like they can't use a platform that that maybe fits your workflow a little bit better. All right, I will look at these ones too. Yeah, so I was trying to find one that that most folks could use. So maybe that should be maybe we should do like a survey of of which platforms you'd like me to focus on, because I can definitely do that. And I can also, and I definitely want to talk about, why you might use ArtStation versus a whole site option. Squarespace has its own like slash landing pages, which I think probably are a little bit closer to ArtStation. Then you have like the social media sharing sites, and just there's different considerations for all of these. So I will definitely be talking about how, where basic categories they fit into, and then just, what different platforms might be better used for, what different types of applications are better for certain things. Okay, great.
I think we should send out the last poll.
Okay.
Go ahead and all right. So we're going to give you guys a couple minutes to answer this poll for.
All right, and I'll stop this share too. And if anyone has any other platforms, I'll definitely, we can definitely do Cargo and ArtStation. But let me know if there's any other ones that you want me to look into for next time.
That's good. It's looking like there's a lot more people who agree that they know their overall story narrative, as well as like some good examples to reference. I think that's good. There's some people neutral in the anxiety area. It's a good improvement.
Great. And I think, and I do want to address one of these questions. I think it's a great in this this one of I've looked at other portfolios or websites and have some good examples that I want to follow. That can be very, very helpful. And one thing that I recommend as you're doing that is, as much as possible, try to look beyond the work and think about how, maybe you all have some different designers and artists that you've been looking at their portfolio sites. Now that we've gone through this, go back to those sites and think about what their story might be. How are they communicating their narrative around their work? And I mean, you can even think about that in terms of different studios. The studios, they are, they're not just talking about one game. They're not focusing their sites around one game that they're making. They can definitely have like a cornerstone game for sure. But in general, there's a different narrative that they are telling through that collection of their work. So thinking about that, going through these sites and just looking at the visual choices that the studio or the artist is making, how those are the architectural choices, how that is shaping the way that you are seeing the work and going through the work. And hopefully you can start to see how connected those two things are, the work with the framing and the architecture. And it's also, and then I think also just that with that approach, the hard thing about those is like you're looking at these portfolios of very successful people. And so it's like, I do understand how that can generate this feeling of like anxiety or just not knowing where to start, because it's just, you're seeing so many different factors. You have like professional works, projects. There's like this very well-designed component too. So it's more about kind of deconstructing how all those different components and trying to approach it that way, versus thinking like, oh, well, this person's work is just like in a different category than mine or at a different level than mine, and just kind of feeling like a little deflated because of that. It's definitely an experience that I've had, coming out of undergrad, trying to create a portfolio, looking at all these different artists and designers and these different design studios, where I was just like, how am I going to do that? And so I think just kind of breaking it down can be really, really helpful. And just knowing that, you're thinking more about the design of that container, and how you can present your content in a way that tells the most compelling story and the most interesting narrative.
Yeah, definitely. I know personally I haven't really been focused a whole lot on narrative, so I think it's I don't know. I think this has been very helpful for me personally.
Cool.
Yeah. Yeah, here are results. It looks like things are starting to get better. People are feeling a bit better, and looks like they feel a little more prepared and kind of have a better idea of what to go for in terms of audience and narrative. So yeah, this is great. And people got older. People.
Yeah, wow. We're all postgraduates now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kristen, for this.
Yeah, no, thanks. And thanks to everyone for your participation. And I'm really excited for next week. Is it next week? Yes, next week.
Yeah,
okay,
next week.
Great.
Yeah, thank you so much. So just so everyone knows, the next two portions of this series are the next 2 Fridays. So it's easy to remember. Same time, Friday, the 29th, and then in the first week of February. I believe it's the 4th, but let me double check that real quick. I don't want to give you the wrong date.
I think it's the 5th.
It is the 5th. So we hope to see you all next week.
Great.
All right, thanks everyone.
Have a good Friday and a happy weekend.
All right.